thank you everyone for joining us for the session today. This is a training session on understanding domestic abuse in housing. So my name is Stacey and I'm the Senior Policy Manager at SFHA, and I'm really pleased to welcome Jodie McVicker, who's the National Training Coordinator at Scottish Women's Aid, who will be leading our session today. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, it's great to have you, and as always we will make a recording available of the session after, which will be on our website alongside any slides that Jodie's going to use. So before I pass over to Jodie, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you would like to speak, I'm sure Jodie will kind of note when she's looking to take questions during the session or afterwards. So if you would like to speak, just let us know. You can ask Jodie any questions directly. Just unmute yourself, or if you would rather ask it using the chat, then hopefully everyone's used to how that works in Zoom, just down in the taskbar below. We hope that everyone will be comfortable having your video enabled throughout the training session so we can all see each other today. But if you'd rather not be on screen at any point, then obviously feel free to turn the video off in the taskbar when you want. So that's all from me. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the session, and I'll now pass over to Jodie. Thanks, Jodie.
Thanks, Stacey. Hi everyone, it's great to meet you all. My name is Jodie McVicker and I'm the Training Manager with Scottish Women's Aid. So just going to tell you a bit about my background and why I'm sitting here talking to you today about this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about domestic abuse in a housing context. I worked in refuge. I worked at Edinburgh Women's Aid for about 15 years, working with supporting women in refuge through that process of getting accommodated into new housing. And I also supported children and young people in refuge for a number of years as well. I then did a little bit of work in child protection, and in between I've done kind of training in all my roles. So it's really important to me that we are able to talk to service providers like yourselves that are going to be working with people experiencing domestic abuse on a day-to-day basis, just to get an idea of where people are at when they come to talk to you, when you're interacting with them. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk a bit about the dynamics of domestic abuse, what domestic abuse looks like to you as a professional, also what it feels like for the person. So there's some of the things that might feel instinctual to us as professionals to ask people to help. But because of the way domestic abuse is and the way that it impacts on people, sometimes that's not always helpful. So things like pushing a person to leave a relationship seems like it's the ideal thing to do and giving them support to do that, but actually that's when the risk greatly escalates for the person. So that needs to be done in a safe way. So we're going to talk about things like that, talk about questions you can ask. But the first kind of half of the session, we're going to talk a bit about what domestic abuse is, some of the key dynamics there, and why it's important to you working in the housing sector to have an understanding of that. But we're going to talk about it, and we know that domestic abuse impacts on everyone. So whenever we do trainings, we're aware that people here might have experienced domestic abuse. It might have been a family member, a friend, a colleague. But even like the people that you work with, constantly being exposed to these things, it can kind of cause us emotional distress and discomfort as well when we talk about these things. So just in advance, we always want to say, like, be aware that this might bring up things for you. If you do want to talk after the session, or if you want to arrange a call with myself or anyone else for some support, we can give you some information at the end around that. Just always kind of want to put that in there. So like Stacey said, we want the session to be really, really interactive. We want you to feel able to ask questions throughout. Quite a small group today, so that's really good because it means that you will have the opportunity to fully ask questions very relevant to your role. So we're going to talk a little bit about current legislations. We're going to talk a little bit about the new domestic abuse protection legislation around housing. We don't know exactly what it will look like because the implementation group's just formed now, but we have an idea of what that's going to look like because of what's passed through Parliament. So we'll talk about that so that you have some information about that coming up as well. So anyone got any questions before we start? We're going to have a wee break halfway through, so if you are getting to the point where you're thinking, oh, I'd quite like a wee cup of tea or something, we will have a point for you where we'll stop after about an hour, just for you to get 5 minutes to refocus your eyes and recharge your batteries, and then we'll get into the second half. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I've got a wee PowerPoint. Like I said, we are a small group, so we'll try and make it really interactive and feel like I am in a room with you. If at any point you do have questions, feel free to shout out or put that into chat as well. I'll regularly check the chat box so that I can see if you have got any questions there. I think it's really important that you do feel able to do that. So like I said, make sure you kind of take care of yourself. It can be distressing, some of the things that we talk about. I might use examples from the work that I've done where it's relevant. We tend to not use people's stories in a kind of exploitative way, but where it is relevant, I'll absolutely talk about people that I have worked with and supported. So I'm sure you might have some examples too. So it would be great to hear about those and just kind of keeping those in a kind of anonymous way, which I'm sure you will do. So just talking about some of the supports available to start off with. So if you are experiencing domestic abuse, or anyone you know is, or even if you want to ask questions about domestic abuse policies, processes, there's lots of ways you can do that. But the best thing to direct people to initially is the Scotland's National Domestic Abuse Helpline. So it's got quite a long title because there's a National Domestic Abuse Helpline in England which started first. So ours is called Scotland's Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage Helpline, so that it's got that separate identity. So that line runs 24 hours a day, every day of the year. So there's always someone available there, and there's always several people available there actually, and they're all trained professionals. They're trained domestic abuse specialists. They're trained in all aspects of practice, policy, legislation. So they'll not only be able to help survivors, they'll also be able to help friends, family members, professionals with any questions that you might have. So you can also contact them via email, and they also have a live chat, because we understand that for a lot of people, telephone isn't going to be safe or something that they're able to use. So I've put up my website's details about my organisations, Scottish Women's Aid. So what we do is we oversee the Women's Aid network across Scotland. So we work with local Women's Aid groups, providing them with things like training, support, policy, help, governance, funding support. And then we kind of connect them up with other organisations that are working with people. So that might be like social work, people like yourselves in the housing sector, anyone that's going to be working and coming into contact with people experiencing domestic abuse. And particularly for Women's Aid, because particularly with refuge, our aim is to get women support to get a permanent tenancy. So you might be working with local Women's Aid groups in your own area already. I've put up the LGBT domestic abuse project there for Scotland as well. That helpline at the top, that is for people of any gender and any sexuality. So female survivor, male survivor, non-binary, trans, that they will work with, they will speak and support anybody. However, when we speak to LGBT people, there's been a lot of research actually in Scotland around LGBT domestic abuse, Scotland and the UK, some of the leading research actually, and some LGBT survivors feel that they would prefer to have a service that is specifically tailored to them, because often LGBT people have experienced institutional discrimination, so they want to feel like there's a service that will cater for the unique aspects of domestic abuse for LGBT people, some of which we'll touch on briefly today. So that helpline's available there, and then the men's advice line at the bottom. So again, men can use the Scottish Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage helpline. Scottish Women's Aid actually run that helpline, but men can also use the men's advice line. Some men, because of like societal stigma around domestic abuse, again felt that they would rather talk to a man. So that is a line that's staffed by men and for men. So that's some of the supports that are available that you can point people to when you're coming into contact with them. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today, I kind of briefly talked about that already. So kind of deconstructing domestic abuse, what is it? Gender and coercive control. So how does gender interplay with domestic abuse? Some bits about legislation. It's a little kind of whistle-stop tour, but it'll give you hopefully enough that you'll need to have a kind of working knowledge. Some of this you might already know. Domestic abuse is a housing issue, so we will talk about housing throughout, but why particularly in the housing sector is domestic abuse important to your work? Why doesn't she leave? So one of the biggest questions we get asked at training and events is, why doesn't the person just leave? There's lots of really complex reasons why people don't leave. We'll talk about what some of those are. And then the survival process, so we'll talk about where people are at when you come into contact with them, because the survival process of domestic abuse is not a linear process. So, for example, when we ask someone if they're experiencing domestic abuse, obviously they do, often they don't kind of situate that experience as abusive until they're out of the relationship. Sometimes they will, sometimes, but a lot of the time they don't. So we'll talk about questions that you can ask and things that will resonate with them and that will help with that. Just going to stop this share just now because I can't properly see the chat box if I've got my slides up. So anyone got any questions so far? Has anyone got anything that they particularly want to get from the session? So we're a small group. I'm not going to make everyone speak individually because that can feel quite intimidating. But even if you wanted to write in the chat, if there's something that you specifically want to get out of today, there's something you specifically want to know about, if you just want to type that in chat or shout out, that would be really good for me to know. And I can make sure that we cover that.
Yeah, it's Michelle Higgins. I would like to ask, if a tenant tells you that it sounds as though they're being subject to coercive control, but they don't want you to do anything, what do you do with that information?
What you could do with that information, definitely make a record of it, but also offer, well, firstly, can I thank them for feeling able to talk to you about it, because you might be the first person that they've spoken to about it. You might be the first person that they've felt confident enough to actually say those words to. So we've got some slides that I'll give you at the end about how you can go through that kind of validation process of kind of thanking them for telling you, acknowledging it can be really difficult to talk about this, kind of validating that it's not okay for them to be treated like that, that there are options for them out there, and then suggest some of those services that are available to them. So firstly, validating that it's not okay that they're treated like that. And then also, sorry, I was just looking at the chat there, validating that it's not okay that it happened, and then also that there are services available, that they have options. It's really important when someone has been experiencing domestic abuse, particularly coercive control, that they feel that they have options. So they might not be in a position where they want to do anything about it. At that point, they might feel like it's not the right time for them to leave, and that's okay, because that's a process, that's a long process with lots of things we need to take into account. But even if they felt like maybe contacting the domestic abuse helpline, just to be able to talk a little bit about their experiences and get some support, some very non-judgmental, non-directive support to talk about what their options are. So what their options are legally, what their options are financially, things to take into account if they are wanting to leave the relationship. That might be a good way forward. And if they're saying to you they do want to leave and they want some support, then there's things that you could point them to, like financial support, housing support, maybe the local women's aid group. We don't just do refuge, we also do outreach, counselling, working with children and young people as well. Does that help answer that a little bit?
Yeah, that's really good. And I did explain that to the tenant at the time, but she said she was standing in the street with the door closed and her husband was in the house. She's like, I'm never on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you help if they don't get the chance to make those contacts? I'm quite concerned about it, but I don't really want to do anything to cause her even more harm or distress, you know.
What you could do is, because she's made that contact and she obviously trusts you, where you have capacity to keep building that relationship up.
So just keep going and visiting her.
Yeah. Yeah. There will be times that he's not there. There will be times and that you can say, like, you have options, like even if you can like think about ways you can, if you are wanting to leave, think about ways you can do that safely. Think about who you've got around you that will support you if you need to get somewhere quickly. It's massive that she's trusted you enough to talk to you about that, so that is fantastic.
That's good.
But if you want to talk about this more, Michelle, after the session, like, I'll give you my number and let's have a proper chat about it, and we can talk about ways we can maybe support this woman.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
So, Amanda, you've got your hand up.
I'm from SFHA Housing and I'm on the board of committee. but I'm also a disabled person, and I have had personal experience of abuse in the past, but also I've done a lot of studying around abusive relationships and that, and I'm trying to bring more knowledge onto the board so it goes through the organisation. But everyone talks about helping out the ones who have reached out, and usually they are non-disabled people. But what if it's a disabled woman in an abusive relationship, and it could be a carer, it could be a partner? How do you help them in social housing? Because when I needed help, there was no help available. I could either get help for myself or for my children, and not for both. So I was stuck. So, that's what I want to get out, so I can make the housing aware of what's available. Definitely.
That's so important what you've talked about, Amanda. Thank you so much for talking about your experiences and sharing that. And I'm sorry that you weren't able to get that joined up help when you needed it. It is a massive issue. There's a lot of work being done at the moment from like a national level, looking at how we can join services up to help people with disabilities. There's a lot of work being done around physical disability and learning disability, how we can provide services that acknowledge that this is happening, especially when it is a carer. A lot of the time, people that with a disability are kind of left kind of ignored. How can we spot the signs? So part of what we're trying to do is education, how bystanders can look at things and think, well, actually that relationship doesn't look healthy. How they can ask the right questions. That's the first kind of step. So there's that thing of helping make everyone aware of what domestic abuse is, and then so we can look at where things don't feel right, because sometimes when someone is a carer, it can be easy to make some of that abuse look like you're just caring for them. And we know that there's been a lot of research done like across Women's Aid Network. We work with a lot of women who are disabled, and it's been their carer that's been the abuser, and they've controlled things like medication, mobility aids, things like that. And it's been easier to isolate them from family, friends in the community. But a lot of work's also been done by services like domestic abuse services, disability services, mental health services, substance use services. So there's that joined up approach, and people are all on the lookout for these things. So hopefully that will come through from what you hear today. But again, if you want to talk a bit more about that, Amanda, I'd love to keep in touch.
Yeah, that'll be good, because it is a fact that there's a lot of disabled people generally put in social housing purely because of the nature of society, and usually, they're so grateful of getting accessible housing, then they are extra afraid to come forward. So, and I know from SFHA housing, it is quite a small organisation, but it's quite a big organisation within Asia, and they do have accessible housing, and it's not just for, one or two people. So you do have families with disabled people within that family. And that's really important for them to realise that this may be a concern that they may not have thought about before. They may have, but
Yeah.
it's hard enough generally. So anyway,
Absolutely. Well, hopefully some of the things that we talk about today will help people spot these things going forward. But
that'd be great.
yeah, that's the first step, is that awareness for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to get my presentation back up and we will talk a little bit more about those dynamics of domestic abuse. So when we think about what domestic abuse is, if an alien was landing from outer space and asked what domestic abuse is, if you just want to write into the chat quickly, what are some of the words that you would think of that you would use to describe domestic abuse? Also feel free to shout out, but what are some of the words that you might use to describe domestic abuse? So we've got control, yep, definitely. And that control is one of the main tactics that perpetrators will use. Yep, Arlene's put violence, yep. So that's one of the tactics. So we think about what the abuser is wanting to get from domestic abuse. They usually want power and control, and then they will use certain tactics to get that from the person. Anything else? Yeah, Amanda, yep, subtle. Yeah, it's very subtle, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through. But when we think about domestic abuse and we really break that down, a lot of the elements within domestic abuse are quite day-to-day or even mundane, as one researcher described it. So it's those little everyday things, and because it's the everyday things, it's harder to notice often, even for the person themselves. So mental and physical harm, Michelle said, absolutely. And that important element there, if it doesn't have to be physical, what we hear from survivors is that control, that coercive control, the mental, psychological, that's the hardest bit to recover from. Yep, better the devil you know. Yep, so when you're actually in the relationship, you know where they are and what they're doing, so that can feel safe in a way for some people. We'll talk about that a bit as we go on as well. So there's lots of different elements within domestic abuse, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you what the Scottish Government's definition is of domestic abuse. So that's the Scottish Government's definition. So the Scottish Government can identify domestic abuse as kind of gender-based abuse, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But what that basically, in Scotland, it is perpetrated by partners or ex-partners, and in that definition it outlines some of the various forms of domestic abuse. So it can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be mental or emotional, but also financial. So we know so much more now about economic abuse and how that really ties into all the other bits, because if you control someone's ability to have money and resources, then you control everything else. And when we talk about economic abuse, it's more than just money. It is their ability to work, their ability to go to college, their ability to get food, to get everything that's essential for day-to-day life. So it's really about resources as well as just about money, but it also might be about running up debts, payday loans, phone contracts, things like that. But then we see some of the tactics there. So like isolation, that's one of the key tactics that we see with domestic abuse, that they will try and isolate the person. And particularly in a housing context, we often hear of abusers moving the family to a different local authority or a different area. So that can also be a red flag with early on, they're moving them to a new area for no particular reason. Again, with domestic abuse, it's a pattern. We talk about it as a pattern of behaviour. So one element of it in itself wouldn't necessarily stand out, but the hope is that the more people learn about it, the more they'll be able to start to see patterns of abuse. So we talked about gender-based violence, and you'll maybe have heard the expression gender-based violence. Domestic abuse is part of what the Scottish Government called gender-based violence. So what that means, it doesn't mean that it just happens to women and girls, although we know that it overwhelmingly happens to women and girls and that men are overwhelmingly the perpetrator, but men can absolutely also be victims, men and boys, and women can also be perpetrators, and it can also happen in LGBT relationships as well. But what a gender-based violence or gender-based abuse really means is it talks about how that happens. So for example, with domestic abuse, we know that domestic abuse perpetrators have very fixed ideas about gender and gender roles in society. So they have very fixed ideas about what a man should do in a relationship and what a woman should do in a relationship. They have very, I wouldn't even say old-fashioned, because lots of people didn't used to think like this either, but very fixed ideas about women being homemakers, about women keeping themselves to themselves and not being out with the family, fixed ideas about how women should dress, also fixed ideas if it's a female perpetrator about how the male should be, about his ability to make money and provide for the family, about physical strength. But it is common with all the global research done in domestic abuse, we 100% know they have very fixed ideas about what the gendered roles in relationships should be, and what these people should do and how they should perform in the home, sexually, socially, very fixed ideas, and they will look to impose those ideas on their partner, and they will use domestic abuse to get that person to be more and more like their idea of what they should be. And there's a bigger element to that too, like thinking about where these ideas come from. We do a whole other training on this topic, but when we think about who has power in society, like we still have, like in Scotland, only 4% of women are in chief executive roles. And when we think about in the criminal justice system, we've got less than a fifth of people in high positions there are women. So when we think about people making decisions in society, that also has an impact over how domestic abuse perpetrators, sexual violence perpetrators, what they think of roles of women and men. But like I say, it can happen to men, it can happen to women, it can happen to people who are transgender too. But the main thing to remember is about that gender equality. So the Scottish Government, their strategy in dealing with domestic abuse, their key priorities, they recognise that if things were more equal, if we had equal ideas about what men and women brought to the table in relationships in society, that it would be easier to spot domestic abuse perpetrators and sexual violence perpetrators, because these attitudes and values would be really apparent. So a lot of the work that they do under their strategy for dealing with this is called Equally Safe, and their strategies around looking at greater gender equality, looking at how we can intervene early. So things like talking about healthy relationships, talking about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, talking about gender diversity as well, and also about tackling perpetrators. So we used to live in a society where there was no accountability for domestic abuse perpetrators. It's not so much the same now. It's not perfect, but we've made big progress, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what I'm going to talk about a bit now is about societal attitudes and myths about domestic abuse. So there's a lot of myths about domestic abuse, about what causes it, why it happens. And this is a problem, because when we think about people that make major decisions around things like children's panel members, juries, they're members of the public, but they're making massive decisions about children's lives, about adults' lives, about conviction rates. And if these people are, and also frontline service providers, if people in these roles don't really, if they believe these myths, what it does is it has a big impact on how society sees domestic abuse. So I always liken this to, I'm really interested in serial killers, and I read all the serial killer books and all the documentaries, and in them all they always try to find out why do they do it, what's the reason, because it's human nature, we want to find out the reasons, we need a reason. So why does this happen? And we'll look at their backgrounds, and we'll look to find something, because we can't just believe that some people just make bad choices because they make bad decisions, because that's just what they've done, it's their choice. So there's lots of myths about domestic abuse, and we're just going to talk about some of them quickly so that we can dispel them, so that moving on we're all on the same page. So some of the myths about domestic abuse are things like it's caused by poverty. Absolutely not the case. Like, people think, oh, there's more domestic abuse amongst poorer communities. Absolutely not true. We see domestic abuse in every sector of society. Through the Women's Aid networks, we see women coming to us from all elements of society. When we look at the statistics of people being killed by their partners, there's 3 women a week being killed, a woman killed every 3 days. So 2 to 3 women a week for the last 10 years have been killed by their partner or ex-partner. That's been a stable figure for 10 years. It increased over the COVID year. But when we look at those women who have been murdered by their partners or ex-partners, because it is primarily women that are being murdered, that occasionally it might be a man, but for that figure it is. When we look at these figures, and when we look at these women, they are a massive cross-section of society, a massive cross-section of income brackets, and actually veering on the higher end of the income bracket when we come to that as well. But the reason that this myth has come about is because when we look at people using refuge facilities, when we look at people that are in social housing as an emergency measure, usually that will be people that don't have the financial ability to just move into a new flat themselves, or they don't have the networks around them they don't have family who have enough money to like put up them and their children when they're fleeing from domestic abuse. So when we look at figures of who's using public services and there's domestic abuse involved, it will look like it's poorer people, but we know that domestic abuse happens. It's a massive cross-section society, but there's also that thing of how we view middle class, upper class families, and they don't get the same attention always, especially when it comes to the media. Also, like kind of alcohol and stress is thought of as a contributing factor. We know that this isn't true, because what we know about domestic abuse is that it's in every element of the person's life. It's not just at night when they've had a drink, it's not just at the weekend, it's not just when they're having a bad day, it's not just when they've lost their job, it's all the time. It's a pattern of behaviour. So all the things, all the decisions you make in your life on a day-to-day basis, it impacts all of those. It's not just one thing. And also, if it was just about alcohol and stress, they would be like that with everyone when they were stressed, or if they were out drinking, they would be like that with everyone. But they're not. They're able to perform under observation. They're able to go to work and be a nice person. They're able to sustain friendships. If this was a result of these things, they would be like that all the time. So they make a choice of when they're like that and when they're not. So that's why we kind of know it's a choice. Old firm games are another one. We often hear that stat about domestic abuse increases in old firm days. The tactics of domestic abuse escalate in old firm game days. That's absolutely true. But what will happen is, and those relationships will be unhealthy. They will be abusive all the time. So those people where maybe the physical violence escalates in old firm days, those relationships are abusive every day. They're always abusive. Those women and men, they're experiencing abuse all the time. It's just it escalates on that particular day. You don't get a healthy relationship that suddenly becomes abusive because of a football game and then returns to normal. Is that the tactics might be different. And then we think about COVID as well. So there's been a lot of, COVID absolutely has escalated the tactics of domestic abuse 100%. But those relationships were unhealthy anyway. They would have been low level unhealthy, and COVID has been a breeding ground to allow those tactics to escalate. So maybe the aggression got worse, maybe the control got worse, maybe it started becoming physical where it wasn't before. So these escalated, but it was like that already. And then kind of adverse childhood experiences. So you might have heard that, oh, you know, like if someone's had a traumatic childhood, they're more likely to be an abuser. The cycle of abuse has got absolutely no empirical evidence to support it, none at all. What we know is actually all the evidence supports that if you have been a victim of abuse as a child, whether it's domestic abuse or other types of abuse, you're more likely to be a victim of abuse as an adult, but you're less likely to be a perpetrator. So again, these are things that the media has spun, and they gain traction in arms and legs, and all of a sudden, yeah, it's poor, stressed out people with traumatic childhoods that are abusers, but actually that's not the picture that we see when we look at the research. So about domestic abuse being incident-based, we absolutely know that it's not just one-offs. So when we think about incidents are one-off things. We know that domestic abuse, it's actually written into the legislation. It's a pattern of behaviour. And you'll hear me say this loads today, but it's a pattern of behaviour. So when you think about when you get up in the morning, all the decisions you make, you wake up, like, are you going to lie in your bed looking at Instagram? Are you going to get up, go for a run? What are you going to have for your breakfast? What are you going to wear? Where are you going to go? Are you going to go to work? Are you going to study? Are you going to see a friend? Are you going to see family? You will make lots of decisions without even thinking about it. But when you're in an abusive relationship, the abuser will have some sort of say or control over all of these things in some way, and there will be a consequence. So it's not just a case of, oh, I like when you wear that dress. There will be it might start off that way, but there will be consequences to not complying with what they want. So physical violence focus. So for a long time, the public story of domestic abuse was of battered women. We now know so much more about coercive control, and coercive control is at the root of all domestic abuse. So it kind of starts with that control, and it can escalate. There's not always physical violence there. When we look at women who are murdered by their partners or ex-partners, a lot of the time there's been no physical violence in those relationships up to the point where the murder was the first violent act. And coercive control, there's been a lot of research done on what we call intimate partner homicide. It sounds really American, but it's what we call it here as well. All the research says that coercive control is the biggest indicator of it. It's not the severity or frequency of physical attacks, which is what, again, the media tends to have us think. So other myths that it's domestic, so it only happens in the home. So we know that when someone has kind of power and control over someone, that will be present all the time, whether that person is there or not, and whether they're in the home or not. Another myth that children are witnesses and not victims. We 100% know that children experience domestic abuse in a profound way, as do adult survivors. So they experience it in the same way as adult survivors do. It's impossible to think that a child exists in an atmosphere where there's control every day, and there's a toxic atmosphere every day, and they're not impacted. So we work with child survivors of domestic abuse on a daily basis. We hear from them on a daily basis the impact that that's had on them. Now, the positive thing is that children, because of neuroplasticity of the brain, because of resilience, they're very equipped to heal and recover from these experiences with the right support. But we have to acknowledge that they have been impacted. We can't just think, oh, they're sat up in their room when it happens, when the violence happens, or they're at their grand's when they're really bad, that they don't know what's going on and that they're not impacted. They're impacted by control. Like, again, we do a whole day's course on this, but where you control the adult, and you control their actions and their resources and their freedom, you're also controlling the children's resources and freedom and that sense of independence. So mothers who stay are not providing safety. Sometimes we'll hear professionals say things like, oh, do you know, she continually chooses domestic abusers, she continually attracts domestic abusers, and she's staying with him. She doesn't care about the children, she's choosing him over them. And that's really not the case. When we think about the complexity of domestic abuse, and we will talk about this a little bit more later, it's often safer for the person to stay in the relationship, because at the point of leaving, that's when the risk greatly escalates. So whenever we look at people that have been murdered by their partners or ex-partners, that's usually happened in 2 to 6 months after leaving the relationship. So that's a massive point of risk for someone. There's also the idea that certain cultures or religions are tolerant of domestic abuse. That's absolutely not the case. There is no culture or religion that advocates or tolerates domestic abuse. What you'll get is people whose interpretation of it is that that's okay. But actually, for people, there will be millions of people in these cultures and religions that aren't in abusive relationships, that don't abuse their partners. So it's just an excuse, it's someone's choice. So thinking that we can provide safety by always kind of just providing victim services is not an efficient way to provide services, because, and this is partly why we've got the new housing legislation that's come about, we can't just keep rehoming survivors, we can't just keep dealing with survivors, giving them support, we have to deal with offenders too. What are we going to do with them? We have to think about how we work with them, and how we can get that early intervention with them as well. And then, yeah, that separation equals safety. Often we see the holy grail as, oh, just leave that person and everything will be fine. Actually, everything won't be fine. That's the point where when an abuser loses control, they become the most dangerous, because they have lost control. They want to get that control back, and they will do that through whatever means. And it sounds like something that's not common because we don't hear about it in the newspapers every day, but the lengths people go to get that control back. In Scotland alone, over the last few months, we've had 2 women and her children in different areas of Scotland murdered by ex-partners within the first 2 months of leaving the relationship. So this is something that is happening. But having an awareness of that means that we can help people think about how to safely leave relationships, so we can ask the right questions and point them in that direction safely. And as housing providers, you can think about ways that you can support that person to be in their tenancy in a safe way and with the right support as well. So I've talked for quite a while there. Anyone got any questions or thoughts that's come up from any of that? Because that might be a new perspective for some of you, some of these things. Cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little video. So this video was produced by survivors of domestic abuse in Scotland, and it was produced to show some of the elements of coercive control. So what abuse looks like, the non-physical abuse. When the new Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018, I still call it new. I think I need to stop calling it new. It just still feels new to me. But so we waited so long for it. It criminalised non-physical abuse, which was really, really important. It was really important because prior to that, there was no way to criminalise domestic abuse effectively. We could do things like have people prosecuted or charged with assaults, but by the time that, and breach of the peace, by the time that got to court and went through solicitors, it would usually be pled down to something like a community payback order or a fine, and there was no effective way to criminalise non-physical abuse, even though that was the bit that people told us was the most difficult to recover from. So now we have a law that recognises this, and so these were 27 people from across Scotland. Survivors got together and talked about some of their experiences, and some of these do include like that experience of being a disabled person, having those kind of things controlled in their lives around that. So I'm just going to share this video with you. I'm going to show you the first half because it's quite long. It's about 8 minutes, so I'll show you the first 5 minutes. And just let me know if you can hear this.
I felt like I was going mad.
Yeah.
No one else could see what was going on.
I never thought anything like this could happen to me.
Coercive control is a pattern of deliberate abuse, over time leaving the victim intimidated, dependent, and isolated. It can be hard to see, but coercive control is a crime.
He's such a handsome man. When we were first married, he charmed everyone. I felt so lucky. I couldn't put my finger on when it changed. It wasn't one thing he did. It happened bit by bit.
Why are you wearing that dress?
I could never predict what would upset him.
Those heels. I can't stand the sound they make.
From the outside, we look like the perfect couple, a teacher married to a doctor. But inside, I feel like a hostage. He told me who I'm allowed to talk to and who I'm not allowed to talk to. And then he acted like it was all just a joke. It wasn't. He's deadly serious. He gets the kids to tell him who I see and where I go. He told me he'd put hidden cameras in the house to watch me when no one's there.
After I passed my accountancy exams, I had a good salary. But he controlled every penny I spent. He even kept a spreadsheet. In the supermarket, I'd stand in front of the cereals, scared stiff about what he might do if I chose the wrong kind.
He complains that I don't call him enough, then that I call him too much. He gets into my email and deletes things. And he sends messages from my account.
You're a useless mother. You get everything wrong. You're losing it.
The way he undermines me, it makes me doubt myself. What if I make mistakes in front of the class? Is it all in my head?
He'd smash a plate right beside me and then laugh at me when I flinched. He knew he didn't have to hit me to keep me under control. He'd get angry, then apologise.
You know I love you, but you make me lose my temper. It's your fault.
I thought I'd be safe if I towed the line.
He kept coming to see me at my work, to check up on me. My colleagues thought it was sweet that he was so attentive. He told them,
She needs a lot of attention. She's a wee bit unstable.
I felt too ashamed to tell them what's going on at home. So I left my job. It's like I don't know who I am anymore.
It got so I couldn't go out at all, not even into the garden. He'd hide my medication to punish me. And when his family came round, he acted like husband of the year. I just couldn't bear to tell him the truth. I had no one to talk to.
He says I hurt him. He says he'll kill himself. I feel so guilty. He told me if I ever try to leave him,
I'll cancel your visa. You'll have nowhere to go. You'll bring shame and dishonour on the family. You'll never see the kids again.
I'm trapped. What have I done wrong? Never thought.
So stop sharing that there. It does end happily, and they talk about how the services around them were able to spot some of these things going wrong and offer them support. So these are all like real life experiences that people had had across Scotland. So does anyone see anything there that can resonate, that maybe someone you worked with or supported, you'd come across some of these things? It's like what we talked about earlier about those everyday things. And some of these things, it's not really clear to see that there's something wrong, because like when I watched that, like the wee spreadsheet, like my partner and I have a spreadsheet for the budget where we write everything that we're going to spend. But I know that I could say, actually, I don't want to put that much money in this month. I want to do something different. And that would be okay. Where it becomes unhealthy and abusive is where you don't have a choice over what's happening. There's lots of different tactics that were picked up there. So things like the perpetrators hiding medication, using all sorts of different threats. So about the children, threats to kill themselves, involving work colleagues, family members, making the people doubt themselves. So these are all like really common tactics. And all of these things now are actually against the law. When we can put that pattern of behaviour together, we're able to show that that is a pattern of domestic abuse. So anyone got any thoughts about that before we move on? Cool. So when I send the slides through, I'll send through the video. And then you can see what happens at the end, at the happy ending. So I'm just going to put you in breakout rooms just for 5 minutes to have a quick chat with each other. We just have 2 wee groups because you're quite a small group today, but thinking about what might be the challenges of working with people impacted by domestic abuse. So thinking about firstly in the role that you're doing, and then in general, like what might be the challenges of working with people. So for you, what are the challenges for you of working with people that are experiencing domestic abuse? Everyone's going to come firing back very quickly. Awesome. How did those chats go?
We had some technical issues. Some people they weren't on mute, but we couldn't hear them in the room.
All right, that's weird.
But, we just were of the view, the ones that were chatting, that you need to take baby steps, just a bit like what you said before, Jodie, about building confidence in a relationship with the victim if they do open up to you, if you see things that you think might be signs, that you've got to be very, very gentle in how you approach it, because you don't want to make a bad situation worse or have the shutters come down that you don't actually get back in again. That's the big risk. And then obviously society have got these blinkered views that it's better just to get away, and then obviously that has other traumas for the kids. Now there's not always an alternative accommodation available, and the family end up in a hotel room or in a room in a hostel, and that's traumatic for everybody.
That's a really good point. And yeah, depending on the level of risk, sometimes that has to happen, but also that has to be built up, like you say. That has to be a planned thing that happens, so that the person doesn't end up having to go back because they leave and they've left too quickly, and the person, or whatever. There's lots that we'll talk about why people go back, but people go back a lot, and what will have to often happen is that things then escalate because there's a punishment for that. So there's a lot there that you brought up in that discussion. Anything from the other group?
We were talking, Jodie, quite a lot about how COVID has affected the situation and made it a lot more difficult, where families can feel, very, very isolated. We're not doing home visits. We were talking about that there's certain things that you might be able to witness or pick up on or sense when you're maybe visiting somebody, whether you're standing outside the door, whether you actually get into a property. If you're having contact with somebody by a telephone, then you can't pick up these kinds of issues. Do you know who you're actually speaking to on the telephone? Who else is there? What's happening behind? So kind of COVID's got in amongst our conversation, and we were talking about as well that how the trust probably that you've built up, it's very difficult for somebody to be able to open up over a telephone as well. And from the point of view of the perpetrators, then obviously that these kinds of things play into their hands as well, because they don't have people turning up at their door. They just have telephone conversations, maybe where they're the ones that are controlling the telephone conversation, and the victim at the other end. So yeah, I kind of think that ours was more sort of that's kind of where our conversation went.
I think that's really important, because I think what you've pointed out there is so important, like that awareness that whatever is happening, the perpetrator or the abuser may be having an impact and influence and a control over everything. So when you're talking to them on the phone, when you're emailing them, and it's interesting, like ways that we can, if we are worried, like some of the things that we've been putting in place and suggesting for organisations over the last year and a half is things like, when you're putting your newsletters out, make sure you're putting in just random information about the domestic abuse helpline. Maybe do a wee link when you're sending emails out about, oh, here's a video you could watch, here's something that's coming up, here's a campaign that we're working on around domestic abuse, so that you're drip feeding it and that survivors or victims can see that without it being obvious. So thinking about other ways that you can get that messaging if you can't get the direct messaging, or you're worried about something being overheard. And there's other things that have been put in place, like we've been working with pharmacies to have like the safe spaces campaign, so that when they're in like doing their shopping in Morrison's and there's a pharmacy there, they can go in and use telephones there. It's like call a family member, a friend, a women's aid group, the helpline, anything that they need. So it's thinking about everyday ways that we can interrupt and possibly reach out to people in ways that are not necessarily as direct as that face-to-face or verbal contact. So yeah, that's really good that your group come up with that.
Jodie, the point that you made about the safe spaces in pharmacies, then where would we find that kind of information? Because that's really useful.
I'm just going to make a wee note here to send you out information about this, because if I don't write it down, I'll forget it. So there's a campaign called, so when COVID started and we were going into lockdown, like the government, Scottish Government got a working group of big organisations like ourselves and other groups supporting people around domestic abuse, and said, what can we do to support people, because we know that there is going to be less people going in, like you're saying, less professionals going in, there's going to be less social work involvement, there's going to be less checks on behaviour, there's going to be less mental health supports for perpetrators, there's going to be less of everything. So we have to get other ways that victims can get support. And we thought about different places that victims might be where they can be a little bit less on guard. And it was places like, and it's pharmacies, some of the independent pharmacies do it, but it tends to be the pharmacies, like if you go into a big Asda and there's a wee chemist there, if you go into like a big Morrison's and there's a lot of the big stores have these. And we did massive campaigns about it on like the radio, and like local doctors' surgeries. So the campaign is UK Says No More, but they've got a very specific campaign called Safe Spaces. The Home Office, which was like a UK initiative, they also started a code word scheme called Ask for Annie, but that it wasn't promoted as heavily. But the Safe Spaces, that's something like that you might want to put something out in a newsletter to tenants about that. So yeah, I will send that information out to you when I send the slides and the videos out.
Thank you.
So it's just thinking of things like that. How could you do things that if a perpetrator sees it, they don't think it's because of that the victim's been in touch with you, but it's something that you're promoting because it's just what everyone is doing at the moment, because we know that this is such a big problem. So I was going to go on and do a little bit about the new domestic abuse legislation, but what we'll do is we'll have a wee break first, and then we'll come back to that and we'll just move on with the session. So if we take about 6 minutes, so we come back just before past, does that sound okay? Give everyone a chance to refocus your eyes, get a wee walk about, a cup of coffee. Okay, and we'll see you just before past. Great. that everyone just about back now?
Yep.
Cool. We're just going to go on and look at some of the Police Scotland statistics around domestic abuse now. So what we've got here is the statistics from 2019 to 2020. So this is the domestic abuse stats of how many domestic abuse incidents there were called into the police in this time period. So in that 1 year period, this was before COVID, so it was a period 2019 to 20, like the April to the March. So it was 62,907 incidents of domestic abuse recorded in that 1 year. So what we know about these stats is that only 16.8% of them were reported by the victim themselves. So only 16.8% of people, those phone calls or records, something that can be put in online as well by remote reporting, but only 16.8% of those were reported by the victim. This isn't a surprise to us because we know that domestic abuse victims, because of the nature of domestic abuse, they don't always see it as domestic abuse. They are unlikely to report it to the police unless they're genuinely in fear of their lives for them or their children. There's a lot of complex reasons for that. Part of it is because a lot of the time they'll think it's their fault, and they'll want to protect the perpetrator, and we'll talk again about why that might be as well. But so thinking about who else is calling that in, often it will be bystanders, so it might be neighbours, relatives, friends, children. So children aren't bystanders. We know that they experience that in the same way as the adult survivor does, but they'll often be the ones that are calling things in as well. So it's important to note that, because when we hear about police being called out to a property that is perhaps one of your tenancies, the likelihood is it's not the person that's called. So when you know that, and you know that it's possibly they're not in a place to kind of admit to themselves or to understand their experience as abusive, that kind of helps us to think of the ways that we talk to them about domestic abuse. And we'll talk about those stages later, about if they're at this stage in the process, here's ways we can talk to them. There's been an increase in reporting of 97% in the last 10 years. We don't think domestic abuse has increased 97%. We know that there's more awareness about it. There's more awareness that it's not okay. There's more awareness that as a neighbour, if you hear something happening through the wall, you shouldn't just sit and ignore it because it's just what happens in that house next door. 82% of the victims were females in heterosexual relationships. So there was also females in same-sex relationships included in the other 18%. There was also males in gay relationships, and there was also male victims of female perpetrators there too. So, but the overwhelming majority was that women in heterosexual relationships when we think about who the victims were there. So when we look at stats, we know that it's only ever a tip of the iceberg. We know that the people that we support, for example, in Women's Aid across Scotland, the majority of them have never phoned the police or had the police called for them. And when we look at the stats of the people who are murdered by their partners or ex-partners, often there's been no police involvement in those cases either. So we have no real idea about prevalence of domestic abuse. We can only estimate it through figures like how many people phone the helpline, how many people call the police, how many people use refuge, but we know that there's a lot of it is unreported. So when we look at the new Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, so this went live in April 2019. So like we talked about earlier, prior to this coming into place, it was really complicated because it was really difficult to prosecute domestic abuse, and often perpetrators would do horrific things and they would end up walking away with a fine or a community payback order. So the groundbreaking thing about this legislation is that for the first time it did criminalise non-physical abuse, and the way it works is that you can, as long as you have 2 corroborated incidents, so 2 incidents where there's evidence, you can then put anything else under that that's happened in that relationship, and on what they call a balance of probability, it's accepted as fact. So corroboration could be things like if you're getting harassed by text message, a copy of those text messages. It might be a statement from a neighbour, it might be a statement from a housing officer about something that you've seen when you've been in the house. So as long as you have those 2 bits of corroboration, you can then put all that pattern of behaviour. So this person controlled what time food was made, they controlled what I wore, they isolated me from family members, all the different elements of abuse. And when this has been going to court, sometimes the list has been so long to demonstrate that full pattern of behaviour that the list of charges has taken 25 to 30 minutes sometimes to read out, because it's so complex, the things that abusers have been doing. So it's really great that we can get that identified now. It does something really kind of radical in holding people to account for that. And the important thing about this is that usually with legal kind of criminal charges, you have to prove impact. So it's you have to prove that there's been a negative impact on that person. It's impact based. With this, there's a special provision in it that you just have to prove that a reasonable person would think that that would cause harm. And the reason is because of the nature of trauma, sometimes people don't understand how much it's impacted them. But if you think it would cause someone reasonable harm, all of these things, the accumulation of them together, then that's that kind of legal test, which is fantastic. So some of the things that that includes in that legislation, here's all this is directly pulled from the legislation. So anything that is abusive, so violence, threatening or intimidating, anything that makes the partner or ex-partner dependent or subordinate. So that will include things like if someone has a disability, controlling, and actually that is one of the things that has been commonly prosecuted under this, is controlling access to medication, controlling access to mobility aids. There's a lot around controlling, regulating and monitoring a person's activities. So something else that we're seeing heavily prosecuted under this already is things like demanding video footage as evidence of whereabouts, demanding copies of shopping receipts, bus tickets, monitoring of telephone conversations, also kind of using social media. So social media to track people, hacking social media and sending out false messages, putting pictures up on a person's social media. So lots of things around that you would expect. And now because of this legislation, we're able to prosecute that. And the great thing about this, like before when there was domestic abuse, the penalties were so low. So for example, I went to court with a woman whose ex-partner had tried to kill her, threw her over a balcony, caused lasting damage to her back. He ended up walking away with a £50 fine from court, and as he walked out of court he said it was worth every penny. So that was what we were dealing with before. People, there was no repercussions. A £50 fine and a small conviction was nothing to someone who had done something like that, that was a life-altering thing for someone. With this, the maximum penalty is 14 years, and the encouragement is that the full force of that is to be implemented. Other great thing about it is that it covers children as well. It does it kind of identifies that children experience domestic abuse as well. So it's got what's called a statutory aggravator for children. So a statutory aggravator is something that makes a conviction more serious, so can give a higher sentence. So for example, we already have statutory aggravators in most legislation for things like racism or homophobia. So like if you assault someone but it's because of racism, there's a statutory aggravator for racism and the person will get a higher penalty. So with this, if there's a child involved in the domestic abuse in any way, they will get a higher sentence. So it involves any child, it doesn't have to be a child of the couple. So for example, if a neighbour's child sees something that's happening, it's recognised that the impact on that child will be so that this then deserves a higher sentencing power. So if a child sees or hears an incident, something that's been commonly prosecuted under this so far is using children as surveillance. So things like putting location trackers on children's consoles, asking them to pass messages, asking them for information after the couple have separated on like whereabouts, who the person's seeing, that kind of thing. So all of these things that were really damaging for children, but there was no real recognition or way to deal with it. Now we have a situation where we have a law that is actually criminalising that, which is fantastic. Then coming on to, there is lots of legislation that covers domestic abuse and children. I'm not going to go into it all today just because we actually do a whole course just on domestic abuse in the law. But obviously the new Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act coming up, it is still in the implementation phase, but we do know that there's certain elements of it that will be put into place. How they are, well, the guidance around that is still to be written by the implementation group, but the basic tenets of that, we know what it's going to be. So basically what the law is intending to do is a way that social landlords can ensure that victims are able to remain in their home, and that the action can be taken against perpetrators where that's what the victim wants. So some victims won't want to stay in the house, some victims will want to move away because they won't want to be somewhere where the person knows where they are, or it might be that there's bad memories, or it might be that they don't have networks in that area. But a lot of the time the person does actually want to stay where they are because the children's school's nearby and they have got friends nearby and actually they like that house, but it might be in joint names, for example. So there's lots of things that this legislation, powers that this gives to social landlords to kind of fight for that person. So it's things like transferring the tenancy of the perpetrator to the survivor. So there's no conviction required, so the person doesn't need to be convicted. There just has to be evidence that domestic abuse has happened. And like the guidance will talk a lot more widely about what that might look like, but it might be things like a statement of a housing officer if you've seen things, if a person's been talking to you long term about what's been going on for them and you've seen some of those signs. It might be a criminal statement, conviction from like Domestic Abuse Scotland Act. There's lots of things there. But the good thing about this is that the social landlords will have the ability to go to court for the woman to have this happen. So basically to get the tenancy transferred. And the ways it can happen, there's going to be two kind of elements to it. There's a domestic abuse protection notice and domestic abuse protection order. So the domestic abuse notice is basically, it basically says what happens with that transfer. So it might be that the perpetrator is asked to leave the home. It might be that they have to give the keys up. It might be that they're barred from entering the property. It might be that they're barred from contacting the person, but it's a way that the social landlord can legally transfer the tenancy. So whether it's in the perpetrator's sole name, whether it's in their joint name, they can transfer that tenancy over to the victim's name, where the victim wants that to happen. And that's the thing, we always want to do that with the person, because it might be that they don't want that to happen. Maybe they just want to move away. The domestic abuse protection order is really important because what it does is it gives the victim a bit of freedom from that person, because it gives conditions on the perpetrator that they're not allowed to be within that home or within that area. And we've put in recommendations when the guidance has been published that they have to be really prescriptive. So instead of saying John Smith can't go into 8 Brown Place, he can't go into Brown Place and surrounding areas. He also can't contact the person by social media. He can't have anyone else go into that house. He can't have anyone else contact them by social media. So thinking about all the ways perpetrators will use. The important thing about this order is like it's immediate. So unlike other orders like protection orders that can take a while to get into place because you have to go through all the processes, these can be put in place immediately. They will last up to 2 months, but it can also be extended for another month. So it's like a short-term measure to allow the victim to be in the home and assess their options. So thinking about, do they want to go ahead with a charge on the perpetrator? A lot of the time they won't, but they want to give that option. So they've got this option of this to have this put in place. So this is going to be a groundbreaking piece of legislation because at the moment there isn't powers to do this. So a lot of the time the victims are having to move out with the home and into temporary accommodation when that's not necessarily their choice. And if they had a choice, they would stay, because it's not ideal to be taking you and your 2, 3, 4 children into temporary accommodation and the perpetrator's sitting in this big house. So it's just something that's given the person breathing room to assess their options. And then if they're able to maintain that tenancy, if that's their choice, they can do that. Anyone get any questions about those bits of legislation or the stats as well? Like I say, there'll be a lot more information and guidance about this. Amanda, just see your hand up there. There'll be a lot more information as the guidance is formally written from the implementation group. But these are the main things that we're expecting we'll absolutely see come through from that. Amanda, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, so when does this piece of legislation come into play? Will it be later this year or early next year?
So the implementation group has formed now. So there's like various people are involved in that. The group with the government, Jo Oscar from our organisation is involved in that. She's done a lot of work around homelessness and abuse. So in actual answer to your question, it'll be early next year. Yeah.
So in between now and then, is Women Aid to go to, I mean, you're doing it today, but solely for this piece of legislation, are you going to do some awareness training on this groundbreaking factor for social housing?
Yeah, as soon as this, it's actually, what's amazing about it is that written into this legislation, again, we can't say for sure, but we're 99.9% sure, written into the legislation and guidance is going to be that there will be training for social landlords available.
Oh,
and not only that, but there will be an encouragement for multi-agency working and an idea, like a real idea of how to do that. So it's not just about saying, right, social landlords, here you go, legislation, you have to do that, make it happen. It's here's how to do that, we'll support you with it. So we're hoping that the government are going to fund bits of training for social landlords, and they're also really pushing that multi-agency working, because we know that whenever we see like serious case reviews when people are murdered by their partners or ex-partners, when children are murdered by parents, when these things happen, there's always that lack of joined up work is something that we see professionals not talking together. So that is something that we imagine and we'll be pushing for in that. And it's not just Scottish Women's Aid, there will be other organisations involved in the development of this too. So it's any major like national groups working with people. Okay, do you have another question, great. Amanda? Or is that a legacy hand? I just heard this expression the other day, a legacy hand, when you forget to put your hand down.
No, I'll put mine down.
All right, it's still up there just now, but if you've got any more thoughts, just let me know.
I know it's down. Thank you.
So thinking about additional barriers, so these are things that if you're experiencing domestic abuse already, you're going to have lots of barriers of getting support. And a lot of those barriers will be things that we've kind of touched on, but we're going to touch on a little bit more anyway. But basically the trauma of experiencing domestic abuse and having someone control everything that you do, what it does to your sense of self, what it does to your self-esteem, that in itself creates barriers. The way that you're isolated from friends, family, community, that in itself makes it harder to get support. But there's also people with other barriers that makes it even harder to get support if you are experiencing domestic abuse. So things like disability. So with physical disability, we do work with a lot of people where it might be either that the perpetrator is their carer, so the abuser is their carer, so they have a lot of access and control to that person for their everyday needs. And when they're an abuser, that's really complex and difficult because they have an ability to isolate that person that is maybe more so than if the person wasn't disabled. And it can be even more complicated sometimes if the abuser is a person who's been cared for, because then for the victim, they have a lot of complex feelings of kind of guilt and responsibility and what happens if they leave, and people can feel really conflicted over that. Learning disabilities, we're doing a lot of work around learning disabilities at the moment, again with the government and with other national groups, looking at how we can properly support people with learning disabilities that are experiencing domestic abuse and gender-based violence in general. So there's a massive amount of research that says people with learning disabilities are going to be more vulnerable because of the fact that it's harder for them to get support, maybe because it's harder sometimes for them to understand the power dynamics, to be able to talk about that. Sometimes, especially where the abuser has a learning disability, sometimes professionals kind of see part of that abuse as, or the control issues as part of their learning disability, which it's not at all, because like they have a choice over that behaviour. And we know that there's people, that it's about healthy relationships, it's about boundaries. So it's about how we can work with people with those extra layers to help in that situation. And mental health issues as well. So again, there's a real interconnection and intersection between domestic abuse and mental health. It might be the mental health of the abuser, it could also be the mental health of the victim. So it's like that. Is it the domestic abuse that caused the mental health issue, or is it because of the mental health issue that maybe they're more vulnerable and find it harder to get support? Sometimes the abuser will use the mental health issue as something to control them. Again, controlling medication, make them doubt themselves. So these are all things that can make it more difficult. And then when we think about kind of ethnicity or BME background, I think even it's important to, even if you've got someone who's a Scottish BME person, because we know that systemic racism exists in society, we absolutely have to understand that it's going to be harder for BME people to get support, because they have unfortunately probably experienced discrimination from organisations, structurally, systemically, individually, so they're less likely to ask for support because they worry that they're not going to get the right support, they won't be believed. And then there is things like if there is language barriers, if there is cultural issues there, if there's immigration issues. Some of the other things there, so age, there's a big source of evidence to say that younger women are quite vulnerable to domestic abuse because of the kind of status that society has on being in a relationship. Sometimes younger women are less likely to put boundaries in place around things that they're uncomfortable with. And then if those boundaries aren't put in place, that behaviour can escalate. And you can end up feeling trapped in that and finding it harder to get support, because we don't tend to think of domestic abuse as something that happens to young people. We tend to think of it as older people for some reason. But then also with older people, there is also something there around, like we do support a lot of older people within Women's Aid, and if you've been brought up in a kind of atmosphere where it was normal to have one bank account and it was normal for a woman to stay at home, and that's how your life's always been, actually breaking out of that and becoming an independent, free-thinking person is really scary. So making that jump might be a little bit harder for you to see yourself in. For LGBT people, there's a lot of ways that abusers will use LGBT status to kind of control people. So it might be threatening to out the person to family or friends or work colleagues if they're not out already. It might be using that to attack their sense of self, especially if they're trans. It might be like controlling their access to medications, controlling their access to community help and support. And then living in rural or remote areas, again, it can be there can be a big barrier there. So thinking about the isolation there and lack of confidentiality. So if you're in a small community, it might be that the one Women's Aid worker or the one housing worker there, the one housing team, actually the perpetrator works in that team, or that's their family that work in that team. They've got a family member there. The Women's Aid workers, your husband's sister. That's going to make it harder for you to get support there. Also, like when we're in those areas, there's not as much available accommodation, so it's physically harder to leave and get accommodation unless you want to be out with that area. So these are just things to think about when we're thinking about additional barriers. And when we talk about domestic abuse, we always talk about fear and the impact of fear, and the way that makes that experience harder. So when you have something that's a traumatic experience and it's a one-off thing, what happens is that you'll get that sense of fear and alarm, and then it will return to normal. But when you're always in a hypervigilant state, it has a really damaging effect on the body, kind of physiologically. So thinking about kind of complex trauma, there's a lot of really good videos and things that explain this really well. And I'm really interested in this, actually, the way that trauma impacts on people and how that impacts how they interact with professionals around their experiences. But we often hear from survivor victims will say to us, I knew what sort of night I was in for by the way that he walked up the path, or the way they opened the door, or the look in their face. And that's because when you are living in a situation like domestic abuse, you become very good at reading people, because you have to, it's a survival strategy, and children in domestic abuse and abusive environments will also do this. So they're always in that hypervigilant state, kind of waiting, expecting what's going to come next, trying to placate the person, make sure that the conditions around them are just the way they want them, because it will make it a bit easier. So when you're in that constant state of hypervigilance, what happens is that your body creates like an overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline. So you're never really able to relax. Your body and your brain are never fully relaxed, because you're always like awaiting for something, waiting for the wrong word, waiting for them to be angry about something. And that actually causes like massive physiological damage to the body and the brain. So things like, you'll notice that a lot of people that experience domestic abuse experience things like muscle disorders like fibromyalgia, and other muscle fatigue disorders, because that tightness that has been stored in your body for so long from this overproduction of cortisol and adrenaline, it basically shuts the central nervous system down. And then like all the kind of brain impacts, so cognitive impairments, so things like not being able to process memory properly, because when your body's in a traumatic state, basically the part of your brain that processes memory is went into fight or flight, so it stops filing away your memories the way it should do. So your kind of long-term memory, your ability to process chronology, your ability to sustain concentration, that can all be impacted in the long term. But the good thing is about our bodies and our brains that they are very clever. Like, again, neuroplasticity of the brain means that once you're out of that situation and in a safe place, you can train your body to regulate itself again. So things like yoga, there's very specific types of yoga for trauma, things like meditation, grounding exercises, these are all things that can reverse the impacts of this. But it's important to know, just for yourselves, that if you're working with people that have experienced any kind of ongoing trauma, that they will probably be in this situation where they're not always remembering things properly. And the problem with this is that when we talk to people about their experiences, sometimes they're not remembering things in a linear fashion. Sometimes their stories are a bit jumbled. Sometimes the things that they say don't make sense. And we do a lot of work with the police around how to ask questions and how to interview people that have experienced trauma, like domestic abuse, like sexual violence, in a way that's going to help them remember it properly, and also to just be ask the questions in the right way, basically. Because if you're saying things like, oh, well, that wasn't what you said a minute ago, you said something different a minute ago, so you must be lying. It's about, what can you remember just now? How did you feel in that moment? What were the things that you remember? There are ways that you can ask the questions with what we call like a trauma-informed approach. We'll give you some questions that you can ask people, because you don't really need the in-depth sense of that, but we'll give you questions that you can ask people at the end if you are like, if they're opening up to you and you want to know a little bit more about what's going on for them. But just to get a sense of like where a person's headspace might be, we always want to talk about traumatic attachment. It's really important. So traumatic attachment is sometimes called Stockholm syndrome. So traumatic attachment is basically the way that your brain protects you. It's the way that your brain allows you to exist in a really unpleasant, suboptimal environment, by fooling you into thinking that there's good things about it. And then we know it as Stockholm syndrome. That's the common thing that it's called. So ways that shows in things like domestic abuse, bonding with one's captor. So we often hear victims of domestic abuse will be kind of protective of the abuser, because they will also have that sense of, why do they do this? It must be all those myths that we looked at the start. The victim will also believe those myths. Oh, he's just like that because he lost his job. Or he's just like that because he had a bad childhood. Or it's just because we're worried about money at the moment. And so they'll like bond with the person, they'll minimize their behavior, kind of deny harm. So we will often hear people tell us the most awful things that have happened to them and then say, but you know, it wasn't that bad because it was only once or twice, and you know, it was only because it was a particularly bad time they were going through. And it's just this complete disconnection of what's happened to them and how serious that is, and about it being that person's responsibility. Because again, like another kind of myth of society is that people choose abusive relationships, that they choose to stay in them. Again, like how much choice do you have when your ability to choose things has been kind of limited to such an extent? Seeing the captor as protective, hyper-vigilant to their needs and perspective in the world. But again, the long-term fear of retaliation, so always the person knows that actually there is a consequence if I don't do what they say. Intensely grateful for small kindnesses. This is an important one because abusers aren't abusers all the time. If they were just monsters all the time, people wouldn't stay with them. If you went on a date with someone and they punched you in the face, you wouldn't go on a second date with them. So these people have the ability, and they will do lots of nice things too. There'll be nice days out, there'll be presents, there'll be holidays, there'll be in it, but that actually makes it worse because it makes the person then think, well, I just need to be a bit more what they want, and then they will be that nice person again. And the abuser will say that as well. So we'll talk about this in a bit when we talk about the kind of stages of domestic abuse and where they might be at when you're talking to them. So NHS Lanarkshire did a bunch of work on trauma. They've produced all sorts of really interesting videos. If this is something you want to hear more about, I'll send you over some of those because it is really interesting. But just if you're working with someone and they're telling you about their experience of domestic abuse, and you think actually that doesn't make sense and they told me something different the last time, it's possibly not that they're just lying, and it's actually probably people very rarely lie about domestic abuse or sexual violence, because why would they? There is literally no point. You don't actually get anything. People that think, oh, they just do it to get a house, or they just do it for, you don't get a house, you know. It's so thinking about, we'll always kind of give the person the benefit of the doubt. Actually, that's probably trauma. How can I ask them questions in a different way that's going to help them tell that story better? And like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But in terms of looking at indicators of domestic abuse, this is something that we're always asked to talk about in training. Like, how do you know if there's domestic abuse happening? And it's really difficult because victim-related indicators are so different from person to person. Domestic abuse is so different from person to person. Perpetrators will have different ways of controlling victims because we're all different people. Something that someone could use to control me would not work on someone else because we're different people. The main way that you can tell, if it's someone you know, the main way you can tell something isn't right is when you see changes to their behaviour. So if you're thinking about a family member or a friend or a work colleague, if they're in a new relationship and suddenly their behaviour alters dramatically, that's the biggest indicator of domestic abuse. So things like, do they suddenly stop doing all the things they did before? And actually, in some ways, that's normal. When you start a relationship, you do stop. You want to go out with that person, you want to see them more, so you stop doing the things that you want to do as much, and you make little compromises. So bits of that's okay. It's not necessarily unhealthy. So it's thinking about all of it's a pattern of behaviour. So have they suddenly started dressing differently? Because that's something that's not healthy if you're in a new relationship. Are they always preoccupied? Do they look nervous? Is the person always texting them? These kind of things. So when we're looking at the people that you might be coming into contact with, some of the things that you might want to look out for, but remember that these things might not be there because there might not be physical abuse, it might be mental and emotional abuse. They might just be really good at covering things up. So it's all looking at patterns of behaviour. If you spot something, look out for patterns. If you spot something and something doesn't feel right, ask the right questions. So that's what we always say, look for the pattern and ask the right questions. So some of the things might be that they always have injuries that they can't explain. And again, how far should you go with making someone explain that? Like, if someone presents to you with a black eye, would you ask them what was wrong? I think it was okay to ask, I noticed you've got a sore eye, are you wanting to talk about what happened? because if we don't mention it, then we make it invisible. So although it's really, really uncomfortable to talk about these things for us, actually, if we don't mention it, it's just invisible. And they walk about with the message that that person can do anything they want to me and the world just doesn't notice, which is really important. They minimise and downplay injuries, exhibit symptoms related to stress, frequent use of prescription medicines. So you might see this when you're visiting the house. Frequently missed appointments or not following through on agreed plans. This is a very common one. Unfortunately, this can also be symptomatic of lots of other things. It can be symptomatic of chaotic living. It can be symptomatic of mental health issues. It can be symptomatic of substance use. But again, all of these things can also exist with domestic abuse. So again, it goes back to look at the pattern, ask the right questions. They appear evasive or contradictory, nervous or ashamed, always accompanied by the person, or if they're not with them, always being contacted, like they're on the phone, they're texting them. That's like quite a big one. They look to the partner before answering questions. They seem nervous or afraid. Clothing not matching weather, that's like quite a specific one, but it's something that we do see commonly. Like in the middle of winter, they won't be wearing a jacket. They won't have shoes. Like the amount of people I worked with who didn't have shoes because the perpetrator would literally remove all their shoes so they couldn't leave the house. So things like that. And again, you won't necessarily see all of these because you have a glimpse, you have a very small window into their lives. But if you see anything at all that makes you worried or have a sense that something isn't right, look for the pattern, ask questions. So home or tenancy indicators. So there might be a lot of neighbour noise complaints. A lot of the time, domestic abuse in a housing context is mistaken for antisocial behaviour. It's antisocial behaviour of the perpetrator, but actually domestic abuse is not antisocial behaviour, it's something very different. It's a crime. Antisocial behaviour is technically a crime as well, but it's a lot more serious of a crime. So damage to property, you might repeatedly see like doors pulled off hinges, holes in walls, broken windows. Again, that could be symptomatic of other things, but look for the pattern. Lack of heating in the house, lack of food. Again, could be poverty, but look at the pattern. Is there other things that also concern you there? Locks in unexpected places is a good one. Lack of locks and doors is another one. Lack of toiletries, evidence of surveillance. So yeah, they could be like the local drug baron, but it could actually be cameras in all the rooms because there's surveillance there when the perpetrator isn't there. They want to keep an eye on what's going on in the house. Change and upkeep of the property. So a house that suddenly goes from being like really nicely kept to suddenly not being, could be indicative of an issue. And payment difficulties. So we know 100% that where there is domestic abuse, that the victim is 3 to 4 times more likely to be in arrears with their rent. That was a fact that came from some research done by an organisation called Surviving Economic Abuse. So domestic abuse victims are more likely to be 3 to 4 times more likely to be in debt with their rent and rent arrears than people who are not experiencing domestic abuse. So perpetrator related indicators, and again, this could be symptomatic of something, but you might not see it. You might not see it because you might not see them. The perpetrator might not exhibit this way, but again, look for the pattern if you do see these things. So attempts to accompany the person, expresses jealousy or possessiveness. So it might be that they come in and they're like, oh, what are you looking at? Are you checking out this pet? These are things that are extremely unhealthy. Excessive telephoning or texting. And for yourselves, this is an issue because it's something that we should all care about as human beings, but also why is this negative in terms of the business of housing provision? So this does disrupt it from a business perspective, criminal damage, rent arrears, mediation services, the costs of eviction or reletting, and also tackling domestic abuse when it is considered antisocial behaviour. You're then putting a lot of money into something that could be dealt with in a very different way at a much more reduced cost. So some of the support for victims, if you have a sense that something's going on, the best thing to do is always talk to the person. And like I said, we are going to have some questions and things that you can look at for how you can talk to people, and how you can ask the right questions there. But things to think about is immediate personal safety. So if they are coming to you and they're saying, I'm worried about this person who's been abusing me, I'm worried about threats that they've made, thinking about immediate personal safety. And the best way to assess that risk is not for you to go and do a risk assessment, though if you had the ability to do that, that's great, but is to ask them, what do you think the risk of this person harming you is? And that will be things like, what have they threatened to do? If they've threatened to harm them, the likelihood is that they'll do it. So we always kind of presume on the side of that threats are going to be realised, because that is what we see. If someone threatens that if you leave, or that if you get them kicked out, they're going to stalk and harass, they usually do stalk and harass. So thinking about the immediate personal safety, so that might be, right, what's your level of risk? What supports have you got around you? Who can you contact? Who can help you? And it might be things like reviewing that with the domestic abuse helpline. They will give really good tips on immediate safety, and also give sources of support there. Reviewing the safety and security of the existing accommodation. So there's lots of things that you may be able to do as a housing provider. I'm not sure what your current policies and practice are, but there's been some good practice that we've heard of in terms of like alarms and cameras and local liaisons with the local community police. But there's things that you can do with that immediate property to help them feel a little bit more secure, thinking about the types of locks, alarms, management of damages, and so thinking about how you charge for management of damages, where you know there's been domestic abuse and they've said that, do you have something in place where the victim isn't having to pay for things that happen when the perpetrator doesn't even live in the house? Or is that something that they're still going to be liable for? That might be something that as an organisation you can do something with. So support for emergency rehousing, management transfer approach. So that's kind of like what this new legislation is going to do, but that was something that some organisations where they had capacity were thinking about doing informally before. Signposting to domestic abuse specialist services. So services like Women's Aid and Assist if they're like going through court processes. These are organisations that you can signpost to. Again, if the person wants to, sometimes they don't want to because they don't see their experiences as abusive. They're not at the place where they want to deal with it and they just want to go on with day-to-day living. They're in like survival mode. And then child protection protocols, so always like what trumps everything is child protection. So are the children safe? Have they got that kind of basic standard of safety that they deserve? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get you in little breakout rooms. Again, before I do that, has anyone got any questions about anything that I've talked about? Because I've talked for a while there about that. So anyone got any questions about any of that you want to ask? Just before we move on, anything at all? Has it brought anything up or made you think of any kind of people that you've been working with or anything that's been happening in your place of work? Any surprises or things that you maybe hadn't thought about before? Right, I've just put that case study into the chat. Can you just all check that you can see that chat? Because when you go into breakout rooms, I can share slides in there, but it would involve me coming in, and I feel like you're probably not going to have a proper ability to chat if I'm there. Right, so awesome. So you can all see that there. So hopefully you won't have the same issues with sound for some of you that you had last time. If that does happen, maybe you can chat. The people who you can't hear, if they can like put into the chat box what they're thinking, and they can maybe communicate that way. Hey, how was that, everyone? It wasn't long to have a chat. You could probably spend another 10-15 minutes on that, but did you have a chance to come up with any conclusions about what you would do here?
It's just about reassurance and letting her know that she has support if she wants it, but obviously like you'd said before about not not forcing the issue, and it needs to be done in a way that she's comfortable with, but giving her all her housing options, because if she doesn't have support in the area and she doesn't want to remain in the area, although he's no longer in the house, then that's something that she can do. And we'll, if the property's been damaged, we want to make her realise that she's not responsible, that she's a victim, so she needs to, if she engages with local community police and that kind of thing, then we can support her through it. We can make sure the property is secure, and we can try and get a restraining order and keep him away.
Yeah, and that's a good thing with this new legislation, that we'll be able to get that really quickly for her to get some breathing space. Again, it's if she wants, because again, it's very specific to the individual perpetrators, because for some perpetrators, these orders will really work. Like, they will abide by those orders and they will stay out the way, and it will give the person breathing room. There will be other perpetrators that won't, that actually it might make things worse, because it might make them really angry, and then that risk goes up. So that is, like you said, Michelle, it's about speaking to the person and getting that sense of, what do you want to happen? What's going to be the best thing to happen here, and letting them kind of take the lead with that. Does the other group have anything? Anyone from the other group?
We kind of said pretty much the same, that you can offer the support and try and encourage the person to seek help, but it's difficult if you know, you can't force somebody to do it. One of the other members of the team, I'm not a housing officer, so I don't, I'm welfare benefits, so I'm not familiar, you know, with the kind of housing side, but she had suggested that you can do an abandonment notice, because they're joint tenants. You could serve an abandonment notice on the partner, to get them off the tenancy that way, if that's what the person wanted.
Yeah, great. So again, it's just about giving them the option, isn't it? And most importantly, just kind of like you've both said, like validating the person's experiences. So we're just going to move on now and look at a few different areas before we head off. So we're going to look at this now, like, why doesn't the person leave? So we said at the beginning we were going to talk about this because it is something that we're overwhelmingly asked more than anything else. So why don't people just leave if they're in an abusive relationship? If it's so hard, why don't they just leave? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my whiteboard up. And if you think about, if you're in an abusive relationship, and if you stay in that relationship, what do you get to keep? Can I shout out or just pop it in chat?
Your home?
Yep.
It could be financial.
Yep. Just looking at the chat here. So,
and it's children.
Yeah. And everything around them. So that's like school, hobbies, Emma's said family unit, lifestyle, friends.
Networks.
Yep. Just got these from chat. This isn't me just putting them in. Some of these are so, like, these are all reasons people stay, but they're really important. When you think about that safety 100% is why some people stay, because they know if they leave, the person will find them. If they leave, also that harassment, the stalking, the constantly moving. Like we work with people that have relocated 3, 4, 5 times in a year. The children have moved schools several times in the year. I did actually work with a woman who said actually it was easier when she was in the abusive relationship because she knew where the abuser would be all the time. She knew when he was at work, so she would get some respite. She knew she had strategies to deal with him. She knew like what kind of things would set him off to be particularly aggressive, so she would manage those things. When she was in refuge, she said he could be around any corner, and he often was. So she was constantly hyper vigilant, and she did not feel safe. So I was thinking about, what does safety mean to that person? And sometimes safety is that status quo of, I have strategies for this, I know how to deal with this. So dignity in that family unit, these all kind of go hand in hand a bit, because there's a certain status in society of being in a relationship, isn't there, of having someone that loves you and having someone that needs you. And there's a thing about, yeah, we value relationships, and the facade we can often put on around them. Like if we go online and it looks like everyone in our lives is a perfect relationship, but nobody's a perfect relationship, but it can seem that way from the outside. So again, these are all things that feed into people thinking, I just need to try harder, I just need to keep going. And again, when you put that together with all those minimizations of, it's just because he's lost his job, it's just because there's stress, it's just because we're worried about money, and all of that plays together, meaning that a lot of that is why people stay. Financial is one of the biggest ones. And if we had systems around us which properly were funded and properly enabled people to live independently right away when they were experiencing domestic abuse, it might be very different. But people on average leave an abusive relationship 7 times before they leave for good. So that's an average. Sometimes it'll be more, sometimes it'll be less, but that gives you that sense of, it's not always a once and they're gone, why do they go back? And sometimes it is around finances, children, safety. These are like the biggest ones. Anything else there? Okay, what do they get if they leave? If they leave the abusive relationship, what do they get?
Freedom.
Unknown.
So they get freedom, but it might be eventual, because if they're with a person who is going to stalk and harass them, which often happens, they will eventually get the freedom, but only the perpetrator will choose when that freedom comes. So that kind of sense of the unknown. From the chat, we've got some control back. Yeah. And it's funny, this is not funny, it's interesting this, because even when a person is out of an abusive relationship, because of the way that coercive control impacts on people, often even when they've left, some of that control still stays until once you get support and you're able to really process it and work through it, that will diminish. It will absolutely go. That sense of it will go. However, sometimes it stays for a bit. Like I remember being in a supermarket with a woman, about 9 months, she'd been in refuge 9 months, and she was like, I went to, you sometimes go out and support them in day-to-day activities, and I was in the supermarket and she was really anxious, and she was like, I always get anxious in the supermarket, even though I've been away, because when I was with him, I had a certain amount of time to be out the house to do the shopping, and he liked certain brands of things. He did not want anything other than these particular brands, and if I went home without them and I didn't have time to go to other places, the whole rest of the night would just be awful. And even though she'd been safe all that time, and he wasn't someone that stalked and harassed her, so she was safe, that anxiety kind of stuck with her for quite a while. Even when he wasn't there, she still got brought back to that place by those, being triggered by those kind of things. So they definitely get control back. Eventually, she probably doesn't feel like that in supermarkets anymore. She's probably fine, but it just doesn't go away right away. Anything else?
You get a realisation, but it's not particularly your fault. Eventually,
Yeah.
not to begin with.
That's really important, Amanda, definitely. And that is massive. That's like a real breakthrough moment, isn't it?
We need support.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So is there a level of guilt for not being able to make it work, maybe?
Possibly. you'd hope that once they're out of that situation, yeah, I think possibly still in it, they might feel that. Hopefully out of it, they wouldn't. It depends. I mean, that might be something that might take them back, yeah, especially if you've got children and they're like missing their dads and they're missing their school. So yeah, that might be something that, but in terms of gains, like what do you get? Anything else?
You get a new start.
Yep.
And you get support as well.
Yeah. Sorry, that last, Michelle, was that you? I didn't get that last bit.
Therapy, help. Now to
It's interesting because I'm like I think that everyone should have therapy. It's like I'm part American. I think it's a therapy is like the best thing. People should be in it forever, always. But a lot of people are quite nervous about it, and they just want to like we have counselling through Women's Aid for people. You don't even need to be in refuge. Anyone that's experienced domestic abuse can have it. But some people are like that way. Like they just want to get on. They just want to get on with life. They just want to go and they don't want to be brought back to that place. They just want to shut that box. And that might be healthy for them. It might not. It's not for me to decide. But for them, they just want to get back to life and they don't want to go back there. So, yeah. But yeah, that is an option of something that they could get. Anything else?
Stability.
Yeah, definitely. So if we look at these two lists, is there anything that you notice about these two lists? Like when we compare them? So like all the things in the top list, they're like tangible, essential kind of survival things that you get right away. So like if you stay, you get your home, you get children, everything children need, you get your finances are sorted, you've got your you've got your own family unit, you've got your friends, you've got safety, you've got your dignity, your network. If you leave, eventually, yeah, like Dawn said in the chat there, so everything about leaving is unknown, it's aspirational, it's potentially, so you get freedom when the perpetrator decides, you get control back eventually when you've processed things, you get a realization it's not your fault, but that doesn't happen right away. You get a new start eventually because you've got to go through the process of, you can't literally just leave the house and suddenly everything's great. You build your life back up. You do get support when you know where to find it and you get someone that provides an effective response. You might end up going for support to someone who's actually a perpetrator themselves and actually they don't help you, and you go to court and the sheriff awards custody of your children to your perpetrator because you've come from a nice posh house and they don't understand why you would leave that to go and live in temporary accommodation. Seen this so many times. So yeah, these are all things that absolutely will happen for you, but they're in the future and they're kind of unknown. So this is, we do this exercise because it's very visual. You can see what those barriers are and why a lot of people go back. I'm just looking at the chat there. Yes, so it can be very isolating for victims once they leave. Yeah. So, and also there's that thing of when you leave, there is support around you, but what about 3 months down the line when you're feeling down and you're on benefits and you've not got any money and the children are missing their dads, and then he comes around and he's like, oh, you know, I miss you, and you know, we could just go take the kids out to the cinema and it'll be really nice, and you're feeling down. Where's your support then? And people get less patient with you the more that you kind of give into those things as well. So that isolation doesn't necessarily go away when you leave. So it's having a sense of what's going to help them long term. So like when we work with people, I mean, this is probably that you don't need to know this for your work, but we'll say things like, what are going to be the barriers for you staying away? What is going to be the potential reasons that you might go back? And how can we work in those together? So I'll stop sharing this and just get that last few slides up here. So this model here, this is talking about the different stages of domestic abuse. So this here, I think this is the best piece of research there's ever been about domestic abuse. It's the most kind of real portrayal of the stages that people go through when they're experiencing domestic abuse. So the first stage, they're managing the situation. Yep, Dawn, I'll send these on. I'll send these on and they'll be sent out to you. I'll put the videos in and I'll put the other kind of things I talked about as well from today. So you'll get a wee copy of all of those. But I would look this up in detail if you want the detailed breakdown of it, because it's so important for getting a sense of when people come to you, the stage that they're at. So stage one is managing, thinking about, you're probably going to meet people when they're at stages 1, 2 or 3. And if we treat them and ask them the questions that we would want to ask when they're at stage 4 or 5, ready to leave a relationship, or even acknowledging domestic abuse is happening for them, it's not going to resonate for them. So like at point 1, managing the situation. So this is where you've started seeing someone, you've got a bit of discomfort about some of the stuff that they do. Maybe like they complain when you go out and they don't like your friends, and they don't like the clothes you wear, and they're always trying to like make decisions for you, but you really want to be in a relationship because you were miserable when you were on your own, and actually they're quite nice and they do lots of nice things for you too. So all the things that you feel uncomfortable about, you kind of make up excuses for it. So at this point you're externalizing it to other things. So maybe they do become violent one day, maybe they do something that's really controlling, and you just think, oh, do you know, he's just like that because he has had a bad childhood, his last partner cheated on him, understand why he's a wee bit insecure. All of these things that you kind of minimize what's going on. And then you do not see what you're experiencing as domestic abuse at this point. Even if it's physical, you'll kind of think, oh, it's just because we're going through a bad patch just now, something bad's happened. There's kind of excuses that you'll make, because that's how go back to that traumatic bonding, Stockholm syndrome. You compromise because you want to be in a relationship. You're maybe not great with boundaries. So then number 2, distortion of perspective. So this is a point where more and more of these things happen that are uncomfortable, but the way that you cope with that is you think, well, I can just make compromises, because in a relationship people compromise. So what does it matter if he doesn't like me wearing that dress? I'll just wear my jeans and a jumper because it's not that big a deal. It's a small thing to compromise on to get someone that loves you and that does all these nice things that he does. And you start to think, if I could just be better, they will be more of that nice person. If I could make the house tidier, if I could get the children to be quieter, he'll be that nice person that he is quite a lot of the time. But the thing is, those goalposts will keep shifting because domestic abuse escalates. Perpetrators and abusers' expectations escalate. You will never ever be the person that they want you to be. Even if you completely change yourself and do everything they want, their standards will still get higher. So at this point, you're changing everything about yourself, everything about your children's life, so it's being controlled to keep them quiet, to keep everything nice. You still won't see it as domestic abuse. So if at this point someone says to you, are you in an abusive relationship? Are you experiencing domestic abuse? There is no way that you're going to respond to that. In fact, you might even be quite aggressive. And this is the thing, like, we talk about domestic abuse, we talk about victims, and people aren't perfect victims. Like, people have emotional responses to things because of trauma. So that means sometimes people will be aggressive with us. Sometimes people will be angry with us when we ask questions. It's still okay to ask questions. It's important we ask questions. They might turn around and go, F off, it's none of your business, but you have seen what's going on for them. And in years to come, when they're sitting in front of a women's aid worker, they'll be like, I remember that housing officer, she asked me questions and she knew what was going on for me, and I couldn't talk to her at the time, but at least she saw. And that, it kind of validates what's going on for people. So even if you're not hearing what you think you should, it's all kind of breaking that armor that the perpetrators created around their values. So defining abuse, this is the hardest stage for a person, because to define what you're going through as abuse, you have to see yourself as a victim, and nobody sees themselves as a victim, nobody at all. Even people that have had really awful things happen to them in that relationship, they will have minimized it, they will have distorted it, they will have come up with all these reasons. they won't see it, they won't want to see it as abusive. So to take that emotional leap to seeing yourself as someone that, and because of all that societal stigma, how could I let this happen? You didn't let it happen, it was someone else's choice. Why was it me? Why couldn't I see? And they will target everyone. Abusers will target everyone. It's not that they saw something in you, they will target everyone. And sometimes if we don't have confidence to put barriers in or boundaries in, people will exploit that because they're bad people, but they've made the choice. But because of all these things, it's really difficult for people to see themselves as a victim of domestic abuse, because it's all that shame and blame that we know already happens in domestic abuse. So this is the hardest stage. So often people will get to that stage and they'll be like, nah, I'm not, that's not domestic abuse because I wouldn't let that happen. I'm not one of those people. So they'll go back to number one. Oh, it's just because of his job. It's just because of his childhood. It's just because of his last partner. And they'll go through that wee cycle. If they get to number 4, where they're reevaluating the relationship, at this point, you'll be able to talk to them more explicitly about, okay, this relationship isn't healthy. What do you want to happen from here? And at this point, they will start to see leaving as an option. So they'll be doing things like potentially speaking to the housing officer, speaking to a helpline, looking for support. Ending the relationship, yet we know we've just went through that process. That's a journey in itself. And ending the abuse, that only happens when the perpetrator decides. And that stalking and harassment can go on for months, it can go on for years. That's not something they have control over. So you might be meeting people in stages 1, 2, and 3. You might be meeting them in 4 and 5, and you might be meeting them in 6, but have a think about all the considerations that they're going to have when they're in those different positions. So when you're talking about domestic abuse, I'll send these slides over and you can read this in your own time because it's quite long, but it's just going over some of those things I talked about at the beginning of the session. So listen, acknowledging that it's difficult for them to have got to that point where they can acknowledge it as abusive, that they can talk to you. You might have been the first person they've spoken to about this. And then that just talks you through the kind of the processes you can go through with them. Some of the questions you can ask. So these are questions you can ask if you think they're in stages 1 and 2. So they don't think there's abuse. So you don't want to say, I'm concerned that there's domestic abuse happening because you've got a hole in your wall and your neighbours have complained that the police are here every weekend, and I can see that there's like loads of signs of struggles and things here. So you can ask them questions like these. It looks like you've got a lot going on. How does your partner make you feel? The one that I would always use is, how does your partner make you feel? How does this relationship make you feel? Now, these might seem like quite in-depth questions, but you're there to help them, so they'll probably be quite open to talking about these. Does your partner ever make you feel scared? Do you ever feel like you're walking in eggshells? What are the rules of your relationship, and what happens if you break them is another good one. And that's like once you build up a relationship with them. So you wouldn't ask that in like a first visit, but once you've built up a relationship with them. Just checking chat here. Yep, we're literally on the second last slide, Amanda. So yeah, we'll send everything over to the email you registered with. So some of the things that they might say to listen out for. So things like, these are like what we call survivor codes. So people will very, very rarely say, I'm experiencing domestic abuse, but they might say things like these, and I'll send you this over and you can have a closer read. So things like, oh, he gets angry at, he doesn't like it when, I have to, like, these are all things that you can have a wee think about. And then suggested responses. And then, yep, just thinking about, so these are things you can say, options. Thank you for telling me. Here's some services you can use. Here are some options. So think about the things that you talked about in your case study. So anything that you've learned from today that you think you'll be able to take away with you, that's us come to the end of the day. Or any other questions? Is there anything else that you would like to ask about now that we've been through everything? Also, if you do want to contact myself, hopefully that's okay, Stacey, just for any support around domestic abuse. I'll put my email address and my number in here just now, but also maybe Stacey can arrange for you to have that as well.
Yeah, no problem at all. I was just going to say we will share the recording and also the slides from today, Jodie, that I'm assuming will have your contact details on them. But yeah, if anyone needs any contact details or have any follow-up questions for Jodie, then you can either contact her directly or please feel free to contact us at SFHA, and we can also offer some additional support. But if no one has any further questions, I'd just like to first of all thank Jodie for being a great training manager today. Some really obviously a difficult subject, but it was really good to hear some of the examples and tips that you were able to share with everyone. I'm sure everyone appreciated them. And also just thank you to everyone who's joined us today for this training session. We hope that you enjoyed it. You'll maybe have seen now that an evaluation poll has popped up on your screen. So we would ask you if you could just take just a minute, it's not a long poll, to fill that out to give us some feedback on today's training session to help us with any further training options. That would be really helpful. As I said, the slides and recording will be available, but if anyone has any questions, then please feel free to get in touch with us or Jodie directly, and hopefully see you all again soon. Thanks.